a retired homicide detective. I've interviewed thousands of people, from serial killers to ministers. Welcome to the interview room. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the interview room on this Sunday evening. We're going to give everybody a couple of minutes to get in here. As you can tell, that guy's here.
Nice new background.
You like the new background? That
Yes,
background comes from one of our followers and fans, Phil. We want to thank him for that. He has graciously prepared this graphic for us, and we are so grateful. It's really nice. It came out really, really nice. Very nice. Dr. Gary Brucato is in the house, everybody, and it's so great to have him back with us for tonight's show. He, if you are not familiar with his work, I'm going to show you it. It is right here. Then this is one of many of his publications. I mean, he's written hundreds of papers, and he teaches. He worked, well, he taught at Boston College. He studied. He has the largest mass murder database in the world with over 100 and how many years? 19?
119 years.
119 years worth of data. I mean, just kind of do the math on that one, right? That is a tremendous amount of information. I mean, it's often pretty funny because when we're talking, we'll be talking about a case, and next thing you know it, boom, he's hitting his database, and he says, "Oh yeah, this is boom, 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 boom," and all over the place. And I'm like, "How do you do that? Where does that come from, Gary? Where does it come from?" Right? And so,
Lord knows. Yeah.
Well, and so his bio is unbelievable. It speaks for itself. He is top in his field, one of the many experts on the Cold Case Foundation, but just in real life, he's an amazing human being. And he also has a practice in Manhattan, New York, where he constantly is working with patients. So you can catch him over there. But more importantly, he completed this work with Dr. Michael Stone, who has passed on. But Michael was one of the pioneers in forensic psychology in the world. And so they wrote this book here. It's called The New Evil. And what it is understanding the emergence of modern violent crime. You can get it in the link below. Even as we're speaking, if you've not had a chance to read it, we would 100% encourage you to do that. So we want to thank, first of all of you who have come here this evening, and of course our subs, our Patreon members, our members here on YouTube. We are grateful to each and every one of you, and we cannot thank our mods enough for everything that you do for us here at the interview room. We believe we have the best mods out there. Teresa M., Maui girl Mimi J2, Miss Sophia, and of course, Laura Waldy. We are grateful to each and every one of you women for helping us get through this. So we ask one thing tonight and one thing always on the interview room is that you just hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you wouldn't mind. It helps the channel grow, and that you share this on all of your media platforms that you have in your social networks. So this evening is dedicated to Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan and their families. We appreciate every one of you being mindful of that in our chat. And of course, it's okay to have a different opinion, but please let's keep it respectful, and always remember that there's somebody at the other end potentially reading it, and it could be the family members. So we want to be conscientious of that. As we talk about Bryan Kohberger this evening, he is innocent until proven guilty in the court of law. He has a team of attorneys that represent him, and the state represents the families. So both sides of the coin we need to be mindful of. That said, the things that are said here this evening are opinion and opinion only. And we are not talking about any one individual. We are talking about information and how the flow of that information, from my perspective as, criminal investigator, with starting this business back in 1982. So a couple of weekends now. And of course, from Dr. Brucato, he approaches this from a forensic psychological aspect, having interviewed hundreds of these types of personalities, written books, papers, studies, etc. So these are our opinions only. They don't necessarily mean that they're facts. Because tonight I want to talk about a theory, and I want to discuss sensitively about this theory. And Gary and I we spent a couple hours on the phone today. I threw it at him for the first time. And we both have some commonalities in terms of what we believe, but then there are some things where we're both questioning completely. So, Dr. Brucato, Gary, any thoughts before we kick off on where we're going to be headed here tonight?
No, I noticed that someone in the audience asked if before we talked about Kohberger, there was anything to say about the Pellicot case in France. And the only reason I think it's a good idea to say something about it is that it bleeds into what we're going to say about Kohberger. That's a case, if people aren't familiar with it, where an elderly woman found out, because her husband was charged with some petty sex crimes like peeping and taking photos up skirts and things like that, petty only in the sense of there being less serious than assault, led to the discovery of him having copious video recordings of assaults, including her being drugged and endlessly assaulted by scores of men. Now, the reason that's important, that outrageous case is important to mention, is that it's a really good example of a case where when you see certain types of things like peeping and recording and certain things like that, it sometimes is an entree into a person committing worse offenses. Both Chris and I, having done the work we've done, have seen over and over again how those kinds of offenses are like a drug, where a person needs more and more and a greater and greater stimulus. And so I think in that case, you see that kind of progression from those smaller kinds of offenses to the higher. And Chris, I think you'll see where I'm going with that's going to figure into this case that we're talking about. But when you start seeing stuff like that, you start thinking about the progression and why it happens and what tips a person over into it. And then, of course, there's the element of taking advantage of a person that's either asleep or knocked out because of feelings of powerlessness or insecurity that one might have. So the idea of taking advantage of someone who is not conscious in that case in France may also have some interesting implications for something like why the Idaho killer targets people in the middle of the night, with the lights off, possibly sleeping, right? So that's just something to think about. But so I hope that answers the person's question. That I think that's a horrific case, and my heart goes out, of course, to the victim in that case. But where I think it's relevant is that it shows that progression in cases like even this one that we're going to talk about.
Yep, absolutely. Hitless, thank you so much for being here, staying up till 2 a.m. in the morning. We are just humbled by that comment. And, we really appreciate you being with us this evening. All right. So the other day, I think we all saw on the news, we followed it in, the court. And let's always, one of the things I always bear in mind is, remember, we don't investigate people per se. A good homicide detective investigates information. And where that information takes you is what you follow. And so I believe at this point, the other day, I had an epiphany again, and this was my own, where after the judge ruled on the death penalty on the table now for Bryan Kohberger, and again, to reiterate, he's in custody allegedly for taking the lives of Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan. And almost immediately, I thought to myself, man, this judge just bought real estate in Bryan Kohberger's head. Because the reason I say that is now that the death penalty is on the table, we're going to see a shifting, and we're already seeing it from the defense, and we're already seeing it with the Franks hearing coming up, and and I said this a long time ago. You can go back and watch; it's documented that they're going to try to shift it into, the officers, the DNA. They're going to attack all of the cell phone information, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But they're not going to talk about Bryan. They're not going to talk about the victims. Because, see, if they do that, then it becomes somewhat of a uphill potential climb. That said, if the idea has been, well, who's been the target in this particular case? And so I want to talk about three particular areas of understanding. One is the intensity of the attack. I will call it the surveillance observations that took place, and then the pre-incident behavior that occurred, and when did it start? When did that pre-incident behavior start? Taking into effect or into consideration, what are the various different theories that are going on in this case? We've heard about, and here this is a good example. Insufficient existence or insufferable existence, he is innocent. Okay? So this is the type of comment we love these kind of comments. Okay? You have every right to have that opinion, 100%. And as we do, right, to have a a civil conversation about, we're not going to talk about innocence or guilt tonight. That's for the jury to decide, as we saw. Okay. However, what I do want to talk about is the third piece of this is how far back is the prosecution going to be able to show that this guy went out there and prepared for this? I would encourage anybody who's brand new to this channel to go back and look at the panel we put together before Bryan Kohberger was arrested, and listen very carefully to Dr. Brucato's assessment of who the perpetrator potentially what that perpetrator would look like from a behavioral aspect. And some of the things that have always stuck out with me when Gary went out there and told the public, and this was before they had arrested anyone, he had made some comments about, the emptiness inside of the person. He would probably be, et cetera, low in terms of personality type. He'd be, et cetera. And I started thinking about the survey. And Gary, what were some of the other thoughts that you had come up with, if you recall, the personality type that potentially the PD should be looking for?
So you're talking about when we had no information other than the crime scene situation, correct, whatever was reported publicly, that is to say, and the knowledge that a knife was used and all of that. And what I had said at the time, because of my work in the mass murder world, is that no matter how you sliced, whether this was using the 4-victim definition or the 3-victim definition, this was a mass murder, right? So knowing what I do about mass murders, what I said was that when a mass murder is committed using anything other than a knife, statistically, I happen to know from my own work, the chances are greatly increased that what you're dealing with is a person who's going to have some interpersonal peculiarities. This is not just going to be some kind of psychopath or something, but this is going to be a person that's going to be considered by other people to be more weird or odd, interpersonally. So that what I said was that this is probably going to be kind of a hot-headed, peculiar, paranoid kind of guy, a grudge-holding kind of a guy, who was going to probably be frustrated when relationships with other people could not be reduced to something of a science. That people were just too difficult to understand interpersonally. They're just too complicated to navigate. And that he would have control issues. And then we talked about how the choice of the blade had a quality to it that was kind of very intimate and suggested somebody who perhaps wanted to get up close and personal with the victim, so that even though there was not an overt sexualized quality to it, that it was something worth thinking about. But that when there are those less overt sexualized qualities in people of this type, there is a proclivity for them to be driven more by an ego, a desire for infamy, a desire to insert oneself into the press, a desire to be a famous killer, a desire to, simply stick it to people through being smarter than them. So that what we also talked about was the expectation that this is somebody who might fiddle with the online stories about himself, or want people in a weird way to kind of know that he did it, or try to correct the narrative because it would bother this kind of person for the story to not be correct. So a lot of the things that we said there, if Bryan Kohberger is guilty, I think kind of eerily fit that description. Almost to a T. But of course, we have to see, if he's guilty. But if he is, I think it was a really good example of how using statistics to profile can be very useful. We also said that, and this is going to be important, I think, for this conversation, is that the characteristics of whoever did this are a lot more like the characteristics of a serial killer than a mass murderer, right? Certainly not the mass murderer of the type that becomes interpersonally upset about something, feels there's been a loss to identity, gets emotionally overwhelmed, goes out and commits a mass murder. So this is very different. This seems to have more the qualities like we see in a serial killer, where a person might go out and get a weapon and have a fantasy of committing an offense for a long time, months, years, and then go out and try to find somebody that fits the fantasy and then commit an offense in a way that sort of fits the fantasy. And we can talk a little bit about why we think that this is more that type of offense. But I think the facts are more suggestive of somebody that had fantasy first and then went out and cast the fantasy with a victim or victims, as opposed to the situation where you become fixated on a person and decide I have to go out and get a weapon and hurt them. So I'm proposing that the purchase of the knife, for example, would have been well in advance of identifying anybody that would have been killed. So I think we have to think about that too. Why is that important? Because, of course, if that is true, then the possibility of a jury freeing a person who may be at risk of doing that is a dangerous scenario. And we all agreed on that. Greg Cooper, Dean Jackson, Ann Burgess, myself, you, Chris, we all agreed that this had more the quality of what we would see in that kind of an offender, more like a serial offender. Do you still hold that view?
Yes, completely.
Yes. And as a consequence, I think we have to think about the build up. What would make a person of that type build up to an offense? What are the smaller offenses? Getting back to the case we mentioned earlier, the smaller offenses that might come in advance and be enough at first, and how fantasies start to get played out. And then, of course, the element of watching, how a person like that might survey a victim or watch them.
And with Lake and Riley's case, Gary, wouldn't you agree? Just watching that guy, but really on video, before I think folks were saying before they saw that video, well, Lakin was the target, and we were questioning whether or not, once you see that video, you go, well, wait a minute,
right.
She was the victim, but the target initially was the person inside of that apartment, where he spent over 2 hours almost surveilling that apartment. And that in of itself really, I think, showed the public and hopefully our audience, those that follow TIR, the depth and the commitment that these guys go through. And once they get in there, i.e., once it's in motion, it's very difficult to stop it.
Well, you're saying something extremely important, Chris, but I think to people who do what you and I do, we get this, but I think we have to just flesh out briefly what you mean. Is that I think what you're saying is that when you have an offender that has decided, today I'm going to go out and I'm going to enact my fantasy, I'm going to feed the wolf, sometimes the person that you intend as your fantasy target doesn't work out. And then you wind up attacking other people just to feed the wolf, even though they may not be the ideal target in terms of what you had originally pictured. So some examples of that, you've spoken on this show many times about Matthew Checchi, and how Matthew Checchi was unfortunately a victim of opportunity in a bathroom, killed by a man who had wanted to target someone else and was not fulfilled, was not successful in that, built it up with the fuel of pornography, and then went and killed this poor child. Another example of that, on your show, we had Kathy Klein Rubin, who survived the Chi Omega house, the Bundy case. And she talked about how Bundy had tried to pick up a woman at a dance unsuccessfully. That was sort of the ideal victim in his mind. He felt rejected, and he wound up looking for a place with an open door, went in and attacked all these women in the Cuyahoga house in a frenzy of misogynistic rage to compensate for the failure to connect with the victim earlier. So I think the point you're making is that sometimes the focus of the attack becomes looser, messier, more vague if the hyper focus on a fantasy victim doesn't go the way you plan. You could see this rapid expansion where you'll just sort of snatch out at a different person or whoever is around immediately or whatever. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and where I think it's going to be a fascinating conversation tonight,
Yeah.
With our audience, to where, the other day when the judge ruled, hey, no, the death penalty is on the table. I think you and I would agree that changes the dynamic internally for the suspect, right?
Yeah, we could have a long conversation about why, and we'll get to that part because you and I have discussed it. I think we'll get to that as sort of the culmination of this conversation. But yes, I think it's a game changer.
Yeah, and so, and that leads me into, okay, then if he knows potentially, if he's the guy, ultimately, if the court and the jury says, yeah, he's the guy. I kind of had an epiphany, like I mentioned, and one of the first things for the audience that we would want to look for as an investigator and from a criminal behavior analysis aspect is what is the initial contact point?
Yes,
with the victims. All right, and so I stepped back just for a moment, and as you recall, as we were talking, I said to Gary, so everybody knows in pure transparency here, I said, everybody talks about either Maddie or Kaylee upstairs as being the primary target. And I think that comes from this idea that the chief initially in a press conference stepped up and said, hey, this looks like a targeted attack. And also that you had the coroner, not the medical examiner, but the coroner, okay, and they're different, come out and say, yeah, this was a horrific, et cetera, et cetera. And I stepped back for a moment and I said to myself, well, there's no question that they were targeted. There's no question that both of them were targeted. But was his target set, and this is where we're going to go tonight. And as you guys know out there, I value all opinions, but the man sitting next to me here on the screen, I know what he's capable of. And so I bounced off of Gary. I said, Gary, what about the house? And what's his background? We know that he was a criminal, justice major. He's got his PhD, but who was he obsessed with in his studies? And I think we came to the conclusion and agreement. And can I tell him, Gary, who we were thinking?
Well, it's a hypothesis, but I think it's an interesting idea. I mean, this is what you've been thinking about, Chris. So I think you lay it out, and I think the idea is you're asking me if I think it's plausible, essentially.
Right. Okay.
So what's your theory that you want?
Okay. So here was my theory. Is this his sorority moment, but it's not a sorority? And was he obsessed with Ted Bundy? And to the point where he's going to one-up him in his emotional development and thought process. And that comes from this idea of his pre-planning and all of the planning that may have been taking place. And the fact that Ted, had been out on the West Coast, Washington area, And then, of course, he attacks, young girls. And so I started thinking, well, wait a minute. Where is the contact point potentially for BK and the victims? And of course, we come back to the restaurant and his food picks, i.e., he's a vegetarian. And then we have two of the victims that worked at that restaurant. And this is not news to anybody. People have talked about this as well. And I thought to myself, that look, hey, if he's been studying these guys through all of these various different surveys, and I want to put a survey up here. And what I said to Dr. Brucato was, Gary, let's go through these questions again, and can we overlay them into his personality now post-incident of what he was building up to? And if he is the guy, do they overlap his survey? And look at some of these questions. He gives the respondent opportunity to get through an important action, emotion, and thought should thoroughly be detailed. So he's asking people that have committed serious crimes, tell me what you felt, tell me what you thought. Give me all those actions, emotions, give me everything you got. And look what the first question, or one of the first questions, number 13. How was your life right before the crime occurred? Okay. In your profile, the killer would have been somebody who's somewhat of an enigma. He's just weird, just out there. Women would tee off on him right away in terms of peg him like, this one's just like weird. Okay. And then look at 14. Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling at this point. That's a really weird question when they say he left his house the night of this murder. Okay. And go ahead. Do you want to say something?
No, I just think, because it's very easy to miss the point, that what's being said here is that this is probably a person, whoever, now let's say we're talking about Kohberger as a suspect. Well, if he's guilty, being the person who wrote this survey, what the collective information would tell us is that this is a person who was not only confused about the feelings that other people have, but confused about his own. So that what you would get is a person who would be interested in the phenomenology of emotional experience in social interactions and inside of oneself. Both of those things would be confusing to him. This is why it's not surprising that when we see his writings online, he talks about dissociation and numbness and so forth. In other words, this is the kind of person who would also be looking at himself like an alien, saying, I'm interested in what would be felt if one did such and such. And what you see in some people, for example, there are some serial killers that engage in torture that we think of them as 100% sadistic and enjoying it. But some of them do it out of a kind of intellectual stimulation and a kind of deadness and numbness, where it becomes, what do I need to do to a person to get them to feel something? And therefore, I'll feel something. It's like they're feeling dead inside. And how extreme does what I do to a person have to be for me to feel something? Because I feel dead internally. And what you get is a person that you get the impression of a person that wants to understand the phenomenological emotional experience of people that are doing criminal things, almost as if to say, if I did that, would I feel alive? or would I feel as numb and dead as I do now? That kind of thing. So every step of the way, what's enough to feel alive? Just looking, thinking about it, the planning, going, doing it, etc. So you really want to get it in here. Like you want to send it in here. And I imagine this being a person who wished that he could do that with other people. This is the kind of person that would almost wish that he could give a woman before a date a little card to fill out. Tell me what would be weird to do. Tell me what you would like. Tell me what you would find attractive. And by surveying you, I won't mess up because I'll have made a science out of it. But the problem is that's not how social interactions work. And when he tried to guess, he was lousy at it and weirded people out. And that's the whole thing. I think it's interesting, Chris, isn't it, to imagine a person who needs to reduce feelings to a science in order to understand them.
Yeah, and look at question number 15 for a minute, and I want to keep moving here, right?
Yeah.
He asked the question, how did you travel to and enter the location that the crime occurred? Okay. So he wants to, he's got, in this question, he's got the perpetrator in a car, potentially, or walking, or a bus, or whatever. But either way, he's got the perpetrator leaving the home, traveling to the location where the crime occurred. So in this questionnaire, he asked the folks, if you were to leave your house and travel to the location where you're going to commit this crime, I want your feelings about that. Because the next question is, after you arrive, what steps did you take prior to locating the victim or target, i.e. person or object? Please detail your thoughts and feelings. So it's almost like a transferred behavior, right? He's saying, this isn't me. This is all about you. Okay. And here's number 17, where he goes, why did you choose the victim or target over others? So that's a plural. That's a plural concept. Others infers more than one. Okay. And so I read just a couple of those questions, and, I'm not going to, beat this thing to death in terms of, trying to understand, is there a correlation to this in any way, shape, or form? But now we go back to this idea of, okay, how far back were the authorities going to try to find the pre-planning? Okay, the pre-planning. And so I went back through the search warrants, and I started thinking about, okay, where did this knife thing come from? I.e. the sheath, where on the, the snap, they get DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, before I go into that, that's his look when he stopped by the cops. Okay, while he was traveling home. All right, so this is the search warrant. These ASIN numbers are, as everybody knows, the ASIN numbers are just basically inventory control numbers for Amazon. Okay, but you'll notice here there are two ASIN numbers, and I started thinking to myself, all right, I'm going to put the first one in, which I did, and this is the Amazon ASIN that I put in on their website. And this is the product that came up. Okay. So I thought to myself, okay, well, what are the other search warrants saying? And the other search warrants started to chase the receipts to Amazon, to Walmart, and the banks. They started pushing search warrants out to the banks. And they were looking for a money trail that purchased potentially a weapon like this. because they had information that, because they discovered the sheath the day the girls were discovered, the victims were discovered, and they find this sheath on the bed upstairs next to Maddie and Kaylee. And now, but then I noticed on the search warrant, there was another ASIN number that they're looking for. And this was another K-bar knife, model number 1217S, as in Sam. So I thought to myself, is it possible that they're looking for two knives? Or did he have in possession two knives? And if so, because why would you have two different Amazon product numbers on the search warrant? And one with this style of knife and one that comes up to this particular model number. And so then I went back and I started looking for the distributor information that's in all the search warrants. And I find out that the distributor who sells basically wholesale product to somebody who sells through Amazon, and could be Amazon itself or Walmart or the company that Blue Ridge Knives is a company that would send that information out on behalf of Amazon. Right? So we start chasing now the money trail, because that's what the investigators started to do. They started to chase the money trail. Okay. And so I thought to myself, okay, when was all this stuff taking place? When was this guy or person doing all of this? When did all this, start? And we start looking through some of the search warrants, and we discover that it started back in 2022. They go back to the companies and they say, look, we want information as far back as January forward. Okay. So, Gary, I want to stop for a moment because I don't want to get too far ahead of you. What are you thinking?
Well, I think what I recall was that I remember reading in Newsweek that back after Kohberger was captured, that they were looking at things that went all the way back to March of 2022, and I think you found that it goes all the way back to January. And what's extremely important about that is that it would imply that if Kohberger is guilty, that there was at least an impression that he would have purchased the weapon well before the crime. Now, if that is true, then the idea would be that this is fantasy based, that this is a person who would be thinking about committing these crimes well in advance. Now, that's more consistent, as we said, with what you see in serial offenders or people that have a fantasy, sexualized or not, that they're going to go out and commit a certain offense and it's going to be kind of perfect, and they dream it up and imagine doing it, and they sometimes get their tools well in advance and then go out and
here's that article that you're referring to.
Yes. You think it says March, right? March
30th, 2022. Right.
So they were looking at a 10-day window in March of 22. That's extremely important, because if it turns out that that is the window in which this might have been purchased, well, then look at how far in advance of the killings that would be. He probably didn't even know the victims yet, or have never encountered any of them, is what I'm saying, yet, if ever. So that, let's say we believe that he encounters two of them in the vegan restaurant. That's well in the future. So this is what I mean is a very big difference between a person who let's say meets two people in a Greek restaurant, the Greek vegan restaurant, is imagining, taking their lives, fixated on them, whatever, and then goes out and gets a weapon and starts dreaming of doing it. This is more like, I want to kill someone well in advance, and then finds the target that seems to fit the fantasy, right? And when that happens, sometimes we can presume that they did indeed target the victim that they considered ideal for their particular prototype, right? As I've talked about. Or it could just be that they wanted to target a certain person and couldn't, and they went out and found a substitute that was less ideal in fantasy terms. Or it could be that the person that they were targeting was targeted, and other people were sort of just collaterally present who wound up being harmed. But the seeking of the knife well in advance, unless he was going to use it for something unrelated to murder, is very, very interesting that it would be that far in space.
And when you said that, that was one of the things that I was taking into consideration. I was thinking,
right,
okay, then what's the target set here, right? What is the target set? I definitely believe that the girls, so I'm just going to say it, okay? I believe that all 5 of those girls in that house were the targets. The 2, Maddie and Kaylee, at the top floor, were his primaries, that he was fixated to get to the top and work his way down. And I just had this epiphany with, okay, what evidence is pointing me, and this is my opinion, okay, what evidence is pointing towards that as being a possibility? Okay. And we have talked in the past, even with Greg here and Ann and others, we all agreed there's a high probability that he had potentially been in that house, either as Greg even said it on, I think, Dateline, where either, because it's a party house, they're probably, maybe some of the roommates are selling dope, et cetera. So there's a lot of traffic coming in and out of that potential house. Okay. So then when I started thinking about this, I started to think about, okay, well, then what are the possibilities? I mean, you have the theory of, the sorority or the Chi Mega or whatever they are, the kids, the boys, killing them. You have the Green Beret guy, the Army guy. Okay. You have the cops are covering up for, a dope transaction hit, et cetera. Okay. And that the 2 surviving victims and that, Xana's mom was involved in, criminal narcotics activity, et cetera. Okay. But we're not, if we take just the cartel type of thought process for a minute, okay? I've worked, as you know, cartel murders, okay? They cut your head off and they put your head on a stick. They don't mess around with leaving people alive in the background. It just doesn't happen. Okay? They kill everybody. Okay? And so I thought, okay, I'm just going to put that one over here. I'm going to put that one over here and let the internet go crazy, okay, which it has. Okay. And then the second one is the Green Beret. Okay. He's just going to target, certain people with inside the house, and then have a shootout with the cops, and it's all over, et cetera. The cops kill him, et cetera. Okay. I don't know. Okay. That's a 2 out of a 10. Okay. And then we go towards, okay, well, what took so long for the girls down on the first floor to call the cops? Well, if it's a dope house, They could be moving stuff in and out of that place. That's a no-brainer. All right. And the cops already know that because they've talked to them and said, what the heck took you so long? We just haven't heard that yet. Okay. That will come out in trial. But now we go to this guy who has come by that house 12 separate times. At least his phone has come by that house 12 separate times. And then we start connecting some of these other dots with his obsessions. And what are his obsessions? Well, he likes to be what we would call a wannabe and interject himself into law enforcement, the realm of law enforcement. Okay. Yeah, this is the other theory. There you go. But young drug runners with possible LE involvement. Okay. I think the biggest, that's a great comment, but the biggest problem I'm having with that thought process is you also have to get the lab involved. You have to get all the IGG people involved. You have to get the FBI involved. You've got to get Dr. Brucato and myself involved because we're thinking outside of the box, okay? And you got to throw us into the conspiracy, okay? That, I don't know, it just doesn't line up for me. For some it does, no problem. But remember, there were tunnels under the house too. And when the house was knocked down, the tunnels did not exist. And so we don't want to go down those rabbit holes. I want to stick with what the authorities did. And what they did was a couple of things that I think keep getting overlooked. And one of them is this right here. Okay, I'm going to show you right here. All right. So in one of the search warrants, they go and they file this search warrant on extreme network services. But whose information are they looking for? Kaylee's. This is her laptop. Okay. This is her laptop. The authorities file a search warrant to get information about her laptop. And here's the guy. You can barely read it, but the guy's name is Neil. Okay. Well, who is Neil? Well, Neil is a member of a task force for the United States Secret Service. And he is an intrusion expert. Meaning he's the kind of guy that can sit back and tell you from somebody's device if somebody had the capability to hack into it and, quite frankly, take over the camera. Is this individual has the capability, i.e. the investigator, Neil, with the Secret Service, who has the capability to sit back and say, hey, this person potentially, if they have the skill, can sit behind a place, or if they are into the network, they could be at their house watching. Okay. And so we started thinking about that, and Gary and I started talking about it. We were like, Gary, does that fit this guy? That not him, but does that fit the personality type? And I think,
right.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, and I would submit to the thought process of, well, if you watch how the guy, his intensity in Lakin's case, if he would have had the capability and the intellect to set up a surveillance system of some sort, I believe he probably would have done that. And so I went back to some of my old video, and I want to play it real fast, of standing behind the house. This is the view of, this is where they believe he left and where they believe he may have parked. And I said this on Thanksgiving Day. That's when this was taken, you know, within a week or two after the homicides. As you can see, I'm behind the house, and right there is the balcony to the back. This area is very interesting from a geographic standpoint. I mean, this is the back side of the house here, and it comes up right up this little embankment here, but then it goes up into a really high hill. It would be a very difficult task because there's a chain link fence here as well for an individual to commit such a high profile situation and then flee up this area. It's, you know, I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying I don't know if it's probable. Now, the point of entry, this would be very easy to get into this residence. So that was before Bryan Kohberger was ever arrested. Okay. And this, I was thinking this is how the guy got into the house. Okay. But why was I thinking that? Well, I am, and this is where the other part that I want to go to, Gary, is this idea of the house as the primary. My feeling is the house was the primary target, i.e., if you want to catch a fox, you have to know where the den is. So think of the house as a den with fox inside of it. And the predator knows how many fox are in that house. And from this perch, he can see clearly
from this geographically, from this part of the backyard
area into
actually,
Maddie's room.
If you look down here as well, it's a little icy, so.
But here's
right
one point we're missing. Dylan's room as well. Where everybody has been focusing on, well, yeah, you can see into Maddie's room because it's got her M and it's got her boots. But down on the bottom there is also one of the other girls' rooms. And I have felt from the beginning
on there
that cylinder,
you'll see the
and I'm pointing it to it,
laying.
There's a concrete block there.
And these are some of the back rooms, bedrooms. It looks like the scene is frozen in time.
It
still
just didn't see. It just didn't fit.
They have it shut down with an officer here. But you can see that screen very clearly.
There's
right
the
there.
screen off. There's the concrete block. There's Maddie's room. But that's also one of the other girls' rooms down there at the bottom, below her room. Okay. It could be Bethany's. It could be Dylan's. Okay. And so I thought to myself, okay, and this just hit me the other day. Oh my gosh. Was he targeting the entire fox hole? Did he want everybody in that house? Thoughts, Gary?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned when we talked about this idea you have that has always puzzled me about this case, and then you said that you thought it was an interesting point, is that I always thought that when we are subscribing to the idea that he may have had a specific target, went in after that target, and then somehow other people were just present and had to be eliminated because they were in the way or saw him or whatever. The problem with that is that the evidence suggests a person who was very carefully watching that house and knew everything about it inside and out. I think everything would have been a kind of surveillance for this person, including social media videos that showed the inside of the house, where where the dog might go, where the windows are, where people's rooms are, what things look like. Because this is somebody who, like I said, would have been studying like a science, to obsessively be aware of as much as possible, like reconnaissance kind of situation. Who I think would have been very familiar with that yard and probably been in it. And so as a consequence, the question arises, well, if he was watching everything so carefully, why wouldn't he have just singled out the victim that he wanted when they were alone?
A great point. Exactly.
I mean, why, if you were that good at prepping, would you screw up and have all those people in there? So I think that there's two possibilities. One is what I have said before, is that I suspect, although we don't know this yet, may never, is that there might have been some mechanism of surveillance. And when the night came that it was time to go in and do this, when some event made him feel that it was necessary to go in, or it was time to go in, either an external factor or something emotional in himself, he had to shut off the phone when approaching the house, and would have probably lost touch with whatever that surveillance is. And in that little window of time, a whole bunch of things could have happened. People could have come home that weren't supposed to be there, blah, blah, blah. And that would answer the question. It would be that he thought there was going to be a certain arrangement that would give him privacy with the targeted victim, and then other people just popped in that little window when he's traveling there and the phone is off and he can't survey. The second possibility is that there was an interchangeableness of the women in the home, that it was really Ethan that was totally unexpected, but that he might have just thought he was going to go in there and just attack a whole bunch of women, and that was all all that was necessary.
All of Ted Bundy.
Well, like the Chi Omega situation, right? Where the idea would have been, well, I have examined this home and there are vulnerabilities that would make it easy, right? I could easily get in through this window, this door, or whatever, and these are women, and I want to kill women. That's possible too. And but so that then the idea would be that the only reason it would look like somebody was singled out is that person was the point of vulnerability through which one could look into the house using their laptop or their computer or their TV or whatever. But the idea is to look at everyone. I think those possibilities have to be kind of sorted out. But I think, to be honest, one cannot rule out your idea. It's just you're the first person saying it out loud. But I think that the truth is, if we're being logical, both of those have to be examined.
Well, and that's why I thought this aspect of this investigation, where they want to go, into Kaylee's stuff deep. So there has to be, like what we talked about was, what's the contact point for these victims, right? What is the contact point? And then I found, or I remember when the defense on January, and this is a report, remember when after Kohberger's in custody, his defense team, and after they had gone through his house and they collected all of this evidence here, all this stuff, dog hair, possible dog hair, blood, for sure blood, because they tested it on the spot, and then other places they thought was consistent with that, and they sent it in. Okay, so they have all of this stuff, and we're not concentrating on this stuff because this is what was put in, the search warrant, but we don't know what the results of this stuff is yet. We don't have it back in the public arena of court of public opinion. Okay. However, what we do have is this. After that search warrant, Kohberger gives them a letter authorizing them to go back into his apartment and pick up some items. Okay? Pick up some items. And look at the one item that they pick up. The defense removed a flat screen TV, a computer monitor, a small box of miscellaneous papers and receipts, a laundry basket that was full of books, and a medium-sized box. But they don't tell you what's in that medium-sized box. And so now I think to myself, okay, because I know what the capabilities within inside of that smart TV are, and here they are. From a flat screen TV, forensics can potentially retrieve information like viewing history, i.e. channels watched, smart TV apps usage, web browsing history on the TV, connected devices, system settings, cache data from apps, photos, or videos stored on the TV, and even fingerprints on the screen depending on the TV model and its operation systems. Essentially, any digital trace left behind by users' interaction with a smart TV. And now if we go to the girl that he set up the the cameras for, remember what her assessment was at the end? I think they took a statement where she's like, yeah, you know, he offered to help me. Okay. He offered to assist. Okay. So he's the helper. And she was unaware that he potentially could have been streaming her every move in her house. And so why was this the items that he tells his defense team, go get? Go get the smart TV out of my house. I think that was an afterthought. And so why then, who was the helper, Gary? And when we hear Dylan say she believes she hears a male voice say something to the effect of, "It's okay, I'm going to help you." Who else did that, Gary?
Well, there are a few offenders that we know of that use techniques like that. For example, you're talking about the incident that was discussed on Dateline, where a woman living on campus wanted some help from Bryan with a break-in, which it's thought that he might have actually perpetrated. She became nervous about that and then wanted help, and then he puts in like a camera to help her. But the theory is that perhaps the point was to break in, frighten her, get her to put a camera, and then he could manipulate the camera, being aware of the password, which was needed to install it, so that he could then watch her in her own homes. Well, so this idea of posing as a helper, first of all, with any kind of phishing scam or any kind of thing like that, you see that same quality of posing as something benign, you know, like a Trojan horse. In fact, some of those viruses are even called Trojan horses, that you pose as something benign and then you reveal what you really are. Zodiac, for example, it is known in the case of Kathleen Johns, if she is a victim. Some people don't think she was, some people do. The idea was that Zodiac saw this woman driving with her infant on the road, and he called out to her that her tire was loose when it wasn't, and that he was going to help tighten the wheel. He, of course, loosened it so that a couple of seconds later, when she drives away, the tire goes rolling off, and then she has to get into his car to drive to a gas station. And then the idea is he tells her along the way that he's going to kill her. She jumps out of the vehicle with the baby, but he tells her that he's going to kill her. With Bundy, we have this kind of thing, but it's like slightly reversed. It's more like, can you please help me? Put my boat on top of the car. I'm helpless. My arm is in a sling. That kind of thing. And then the idea is that if you're kind to him, you get punished for being foolish enough to to think that you're punished for being kind and trusting someone, because he once upon a time trusted the woman that he was dating, who dumped him, which set everything off. The mother that was pretending to be a sister, and he was made a fool of. So the idea is to project that onto someone and say, oh, you're helping someone, you're a fool, that kind of thing. So we see both sides of it. We see helping as a you're an idiot who's kind to people, and we see it as, I'm the savior that's going to help you, but really I'm a wolf in sheep's clothing. And there are many, many offenders we could talk about who use these ruses. But what's interesting about it is that that's the kind of ruse you would see in a very organized, grooming, kind of clever, reptilian kind of offender, whereas we generally think of Kohberger, if he's guilty, as being more weird and not particularly slick in that way. But I think that it is interesting to think about. So another example of this, Chris, is that one of the things we've talked about is that incident in March before the offenses, where a woman living in that house, if I remember, found that her car had been broken into and her underwear was sort of strangely stuffed into remember that? And all her stuff is in like a suitcase outside the vehicle. And no one ever really figured out if it was connected in any way, if he was even out there at that time, if he's even involved. But I have to say that what fascinated me about it is that if he did do that, one way to think about it is that it's like the heating up we were talking about, where you start out with peeping and underwear and you eventually may progress. But another way to think about it is that the point might have been to frighten the women in the house so much that they'd want to install a camera. And then the idea is that you take advantage of it to watch them. First, you need the incident that frightens them, and then you take advantage of the camera. And that's one of the things I want to understand is, if after that event, did they install a camera? Or something that could be manipulated? Because it does seem that this is somebody who would be interested in feeling power over people, a godlike power over people, because he was more intelligent when it came to technology. It also is possible that he was looking at things like people's locations, as could be inferred from social media posts. Could you figure out where they are at the time that they post it and figure out exactly where they are? So I think that when you look, like we said earlier, if the idea is to reduce somebody to a science, to make them a perfectly predictable object, well, what better way to know everything about them and have that feeling than to be watching them somehow, studying them like a microbe in a petri dish at all times without their knowledge, and you would have that godlike feeling the whole time. So I think that whole idea of I'm the helper, I'm benign or whatever, I'm the caretaker. It's almost like you imagine a person who feels like they're in the position of God.
Well, and
right? I'm the one who can be benevolent or hurt you. I have all the power. I can give you kindness and I can give you cruelty if you just cooperate, or it's a godlike position.
So let's stay on that train. Stay on that train, okay? Because I love what you're thinking, because one of the things that I think we can establish pretty easily is what are the possible contact points, right? And one of them, what's the original place that the victimology would have placed these two together, and of course this is from the restaurant, so there's a possibility that this could be a contact point, and here, we have both Madison and Xana who are working at that restaurant. Okay, now, what are the second potential contact points? Well, let's look at what the police were looking at. And what are the police looking at? They're looking at everything Okay, I'm going to blow that up here real fast. Everything under the sun here. These are all the search warrants. I think here, all of this is chasing the money. Okay, the American Express, Apple, AT&T, Bank of America, Banner, blah, blah, blah. Here's the Blue Ridge Knife Company. Okay, but look what else they're doing. They're getting to a place where they are chasing all of the social media on everybody. So they're looking for that contact point, Match Group, Meta platforms, PayPal, Reddit, Snap, T-Mobile, the banks, meaning, Yik Yak, okay, Yahoo, Walmart. I read this one again. That's for the knife. They're looking for the knife. But you see the order of the investigation is very succinct, meaning they're looking for the knife, receipts, purchases, the money trail, banks. Simultaneously, they're looking for the trail on these kind of things. We want to know if anything could have got into the network in the house. And we're going to start with Kaylee's computer. This is her laptop. Okay. This is her laptop. And what their intrusion guy from the Secret Service was able to do, and we don't know the results of what he found, but we definitely know it was important enough to get a search warrant from a judge to go into to see if there's a connection. And now when you start thinking about that and making the connection back to what Kohberger wanted to do, remember, he wanted to train the police on network technology connectivities so that they could catch people doing this type of stuff.
But you see, Chris, that same point of confusion. Am I a helper or the bad guy?
Right.
I could be the helper if you're nice to me, and I could be the bad guy if you're not. I could work for law enforcement, or I could not. Sherlock Holmes used to always joke to Watson, it's a good thing that I'm not a criminal, right? Because if he had applied his intelligence to evil, the police would have been in a lot of trouble. So I think it's the ultimate grandiose thing to feel.
And to your point, think about it. Ted, I remember the judge at sentencing said, Mr. Bundy, you are brilliant. I would have loved to have you practice law in front of my court. Unfortunately, you selected a different route. And now think about how deviant Ted Bundy was, right? I mean, he's number 22. He's a 22, right, Gary?
No, because there was no protracted torture. So he's a 18.
And I think if he's innocent until proven guilty in a court of law, but hypothetically right now he's in custody. It doesn't mean he did it. But that said, is he a 16?
Kohberger, if he's guilty, would be a 16. Yes, yeah. He would be a 16 of the mastermind type, the type who is motivated, even though there might be little subtle sexual qualities to the crime, is ultimately motivated by ego, and that is extremely important when it comes to getting people to confess and open up about crimes. Is to play on that ego point. I don't know if that's something you want to delve into now, but yes, I think this is somebody who would experience domination, control, and manipulation of others through intellectual superiority.
Okay, so let's stay on that point. So here was my the other part of this hypothesis / theory. He runs across the girls Okay. And he goes, huh, jackpot. Goes on to this quest of dominance and control, mentally first, fantasy, plays it out, starts seeking, social media, starts, surveilling, driving around, and then all of a sudden has an aha moment and goes, oh, wow, there's 5 of them. And they all live in this house. Okay. And now he starts to play it out further, just kind of like others. Okay. And he tries to slip into their direct messaging. Okay. And he starts to get rejected by one of the victims not answering. Okay. I talked to Kaylee's parents, and they showed me some information that they know because it's his name, that he was trying to communicate with their daughter. And now I want you to take that set, let's say it's a set of facts, and ask and tell me, okay, why is he intense on getting into that house and taking it as potentially, if he's the guy, to kill?
Right. Well, it's a little complicated, Chris, because there are 2 possibilities. One is that he becomes fixated on one person or 2 people who might fit the fantasy of what it is he's been thinking about for a while. He sort of casts it like a movie director, as I always say, right? They kind of look the part and hones in and then gets in that house and does what he does. The other possibility is that the only characteristic necessary for the victim was being female, and that then all you need is a vulnerable setting to go in and just do whatever you're going to do. Now, there are a few things that would come to mind if that was the case. For example, if you were going to go into a house with a whole bunch of, let's say he even just thought the women were there. He didn't know about Ethan. He just thinks the women are there sleeping. Number one, would you really only bring in a K-bar knife? Would you bring other things? Would you bring rope? Would you bring things to play out perverse fantasies? Or would you bring in, more than a knife? Would you bring in, like BTK used to do, would you bring in a gun just in case you needed it because things got out of control? A little odd for somebody with that kind of fantasy of being in control to just go in there that unprepared. It's almost hard to believe he didn't go in with anything else. So that's number one. Number two, it's interesting to think about why somebody who was supposedly surveying the place so well wouldn't know that Ethan was there. Wouldn't know, that's a little weird to me. Number three, why does he leave 2 of the women alive? Did he sort of do what he went in there to do and just got tired? Did he get scared? Did time run out? In other words, it's all impossible to tell. But we do think, I think you would agree that so far what the concrete evidence suggests is he certainly at least tried to make contact with 1 or 2 of the original, of the people in that house, and they at least were potentially the initial focus. But I think your point cannot be disproved yet currently. It has to be entertained as a possibility, is that he just looked for a vulnerable place that was filled with women and wanted to go in there. Now, the reason it's interesting you keep mentioning Bundy is the idea that we know this guy was studying offenders. We know that he was in class with a member of the cold case family.
Do you think he read your book? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but by the way, if anybody hasn't read this book, totally read this book.
The honest answer to that.
Will it surprise you? Would it surprise you?
Well, let me put it to you like this.
Sorry.
one of the people who wrote about my book a couple of times and who blurbed the book and who, happened by complete coincidence to have been his professor. If he was fixated on, what his professor was putting out there, it's possible he would have discovered the book that way. He could have heard about it just as somebody interested in violent crime. To be frank, I do suspect he probably did, because I think a lot of people who are studying violent crime do come across it, and it's a very popular book in those circles. Let's just say I wouldn't be surprised if he was studying those things. I remember when Vernon Gayberth, who also blurbed the book, he told me that I should be careful when I put that book out, because one day I was going to find out that it was found on a crime scene. He said, one of these days that's going to happen. The police are going to tell you this guy who did this horrible thing was studying your book. And I know that's a warning he's given to other people, and he of course has to bear in mind for himself. But when we put these things out there, they're going to be read by people who want to understand crime from the angle of stopping it, and who are going to want to understand it from the angle of doing it. And again, you get that duality. Am I the helper or am I the bad guy? So no, I would not be surprised if he did. I think there are certain books that true crime people tend to have, and I wouldn't be shocked at all if he was doing, especially if he was trying to do an expert analysis of offenders and really understand them from like 30,000 feet. But Chris, I think those points, they do have to be kind of dissected a little bit. In other words, how would you, if you were taking the approach that he was studying offenders among the possibility of a few people that he might have been admiring or imitating, there are some things that smack of Bundy. Is interesting, as at least one of the people that he might have been interested in or learned about in class or whatever, or been reading about or wanted to be better than or whatever. How would you explain the leaving some of the women alive from that angle, from this hypothesis you're putting out there?
I would think that he did not anticipate Ethan.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
And that, so he had his kill kit, i.e. his clothing, his mask, the knife, everything was ready for that evening. He makes his way through the back slider, makes his way all the way up to the top floor. And it would not surprise me if he didn't check Kaylee's room first, or Madison's room, and just kind of like look in, because I don't know if he knew exactly, unless he had been in that house before. And when I talked about, the drug house, I'm not saying the house as a whole, that all the girls were involved in drugs. That if I said that, meaning gave that impression, that's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm saying is, could somebody have been selling drugs or doing drugs, anything like that? Is that a possibility? We have to keep that on the table of saying, yes, that could be a possibility. Okay? But it doesn't mean it's a, quote, cartel, drop house / distribution and all this other stuff. I will tell you, again, the cartel theory for me is over here. So going back to the question, if it gets to the third floor and he brutally attacks 2 sleeping victims, Kaylee and Madison, the dog is in play because there is a recording at 04:17 in the morning where you can hear a dog barking and whimpering. This is from not only a camera 50 feet from the bedrooms, one of the bedrooms at the 3rd floor, but you also have testimony from Dylan, who says, I thought I heard them playing with the dog upstairs. And that was one of the reasons she gives for closing the door. But the disturbing part for me is the whimpering noise, i.e., somebody's still alive. And then, so I think he commits those 2 murders, 2 down, anticipating I now go to the 2nd floor and I work on the other 2, i.e., Dylan and Xana. But she's not on that floor that morning. She's on the 1st floor. Okay. And I think he, in my opinion, if these things are all lining up like Ted Bundy, and Ted Bundy went room to room and came back, and we had one of his victims on here not long ago, where he hit her with a log, right? A fireplace log, if I remember right, Gary.
Mm-hmm.
And then didn't he pick up the fireplace pick and he started using that as a weapon, or was it just the log? I don't recall.
He was biting and using the log. It was a ferocious attack where he used a weapon of opportunity, essentially a rather phallic, actually, in many ways. But everything about it showed a kind of regression into a totally animal appetite, where these women were completely interchangeable. I always thought that the interesting thing about the Chi Omega case was that it showed what was really underneath.
I had it wrong. Lisa's correct. She corrected me. Dylan was on the 2nd floor. Sorry.
Right. But it shows what was really at the heart of Bundy's, the interchangeableness of women, right? And then the kind of literally biting into the buttocks and beating and ripping I still can remember when we had Kathy on talking about being in her bed, sleeping, and then just the whump of somebody just coming and, doing that. It's beyond imagination. Remember, she talked about being in the hospital with the jaw wired, and having thought, visualization exercises to imagine herself on a little island floating away from it, and all of that. I mean, it's just unfathomable. But I think what you're getting at is that I think what you're saying is that among the people that he studied in class or alone or whatever, that you're suspicious that Bundy was of particular interest to him.
Completely.
And that if Bundy was of particular interest, now that's going to all be borne out. I'm sure we're going to find out, as with many of these offenders, that are people who he studied the most or was most interested in. There are some interesting parallels. I mean, Bundy started out a peeper, had a kind of free-floating rage with women because he didn't sort of look the way that he was inside, right? So think of Kohberger having sort of worked out and changed his physical appearance and whatever, and yet inside was still profoundly insecure and so forth. The feeling of women kind of maybe mocking him or being disinterested in him or thinking he was weird, the anger, the idea of potentially needing to kind of go in and into a private residence associated with a college and just ferociously kind of, attack. It's interesting to think about. It definitely is. But I think one of the things I hope happens is that if there is a guilty verdict, I hope that this is somebody who will then open up and start to talk about where the seeds of what he did, and we can learn who he was studying and learning from.
So here, finishing the thought process of the killings.
Right.
I had forgotten that Dylan was on the same floor. It makes, because, he passed the door. Okay.
Right.
But why does he pass her door? I think because he's exhausted. He did not anticipate Ethan in that house.
Right.
He had not done his homework that night. He came late in the morning, early morning hours. and struck while all of the girls should have been sleeping. And the evidence is most of them were. Xana got a DoorDash, and the evidence is showing that she was on TikTok. So Ethan could have been laying down and then attacked in the bed. The evidence is, based on the police's observation, Xana's on the floor. Now, why does he walk past Dylan? I really believe, and I've talked to a lot of killers, they didn't realize, okay, two things. One, we've got about 17 minutes or thereabouts because they hear the car. The PD says the whole thing goes down 0400 to 0425, but there's a car leaving, I think at about 0420, the white Hyundai Elantra. So I think that the murderer was exhausted and he was running out of time. And his risk level was at the ceiling. And if it goes into his personality type of this potentially being his first strike. So what I think we can think through here is, these guys, they don't realize that after they kill, they have a lot more problems that they have to deal with. And I think that's where the
survey is
the
interesting.
survey comes. Exactly. He was processing pre-incident how am I going to emotionally respond? How am I going to physically respond? Well, how did they respond? I.e., hey, here's a survey to any of you, and he asked specifically about felonies. And then he asked, before making your move, what did you do? How did you do it? When did you do it? Look at this one here. How did you travel to and enter the location that the crime occurred? After arriving, what steps did you take prior to locating the victim? Okay. You see, he's got himself arriving at a location in this question and then finding the target. It's like, he wants people to respond to him. Well, when I pulled up to the bank, I knew when I walked in, the vault was going to be on the left side of the house there, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And then, and this is one that has bothered me. Why did you choose that victim or target over others, i.e., more than one? Why? I mean, that question of itself. And then he says, before making your move, how did you approach the victim or target? Please detail what you were thinking and feeling. So, hypothetically, okay, did he not anticipate Ethan coming at him and this fight going on? Because look at the next question. What was the first move you made in order to accomplish your goal? Please detail any thoughts and feelings at this point, i.e., got any advice? What advice do you have? And then he says, how did you accomplish your goal? Please explain what you were thinking and feeling. And then 21, before leaving, is there anything else you did? And then 22, how did you leave the scene? This is all from his mind creating this survey. And you made an interesting observation, Gary, when the defense wanted to bring surveys in.
Remember what you mean?
Remember saying that when they hired?
Oh yeah, right.
I
almost wondered if it was his idea.
Right. Yeah.
Because he always seems to be pulling the strings,
Right.
So I wondered if, that's where that idea came from, right?
So I think if Ethan wasn't there, and this is just my opinion, he would have killed Dylan, and he would have killed Bethany, and he would have killed all 5 girls if he's the guy in that house, that target, quote unquote.
So you think that the reason some people survived is the same reason some people did in the Chi Omega house? Chance.
Exactly.
There's a book I have here that talks. It was written by a Catholic priest who said that he heard a story from another Catholic priest about a woman who was in the house, the Chi Omega house, who lived. And the story she told her priest is that Bundy walked into the room to kill her in the Chi Omega house, and she was praying the rosary. And he looked down at the rosary and walked out. And she always believed that she was spared supernaturally. She told that story to her priest. Well, it's an interesting story because what it suggests again is that arbitrariness, that of him probably opening doors, seeing women, arbitrating who was going to live and die, trying to kill some and not completing the act, completing some, but he was just in a kind of a frenzy. And I think the point with that kind of thing of letting some live and some die is that godlike feeling of I decide, I'm the arbiter of life and death, And but I also think we have to remember that Bundy, Kohberger talked in his online writings, if they're his, about dissociation and visual snow and feeling depersonalized and derealized. And it's interesting to think about the idea that he might have just been so overwhelmed and dissociated and that he blipped out, left the sheath, strolled out, looked at one of the victims and just walked right out. Because I think, Chris, what's so interesting about this is, again, we have to think of somebody who thinks like an experimenter and who thought that he had potentially created a highly controlled kind of situation and overestimated the control that he would be able to assert, and probably discovered in response to his own survey that when you're actually in there, it's not that neat, that feelings overtake you, that you go in thinking you're going to be a master of control and have all the feelings in your fist. And instead, it's just another situation where you're sloppy and weird and out of control because your emotions take over and other people's emotions take over. So that I think he thought, if he's guilty, I think he thought that killing was going to be the solution to the problem of relating to people and finding that he was out of control and whatever. And instead, it was just another example of it. People don't behave the way you think they're going to behave. Things don't go the way you expect. It's not a science. But I'm very interested in this hypothesis that you're putting out there, because I haven't heard anybody come up with anything that argues against it, that it could just be that, he went in there with the idea of, this is a vulnerable house filled with young women, and I'm just mad at young women. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody raise before.
And
who knows yet?
And this is why things are going 100 miles an hour in so many different directions. But what we're going by tonight, collectively as the chat and members, our TIR subscribers and friends who are with us here, is coming 100% from the documentation that's available to the public, i.e., through the law enforcement authorities. Okay, everything that we're talking about tonight, I'm pulling from the available material. Okay, this question here is going to be asked extensively.
Yes, I agree. It's one of the big puzzles that has bothered me There are a lot of a little Columbo-like little things that bother me, like why wasn't the dog killed? You know, and things like that that I want the answers to. Yes, but this is one
And
of them.
Gary, look at that. What Sharon just said. You are 1,000% right. Had he gotten away with it,
Yeah.
okay, in his mind, if he's the guy, i.e., the DNA, they're going to have a big bar to go over. That's a very big bar. In fact, 27 or whatever it is zeros at the end of the probabilities. Okay, that it's not that it's not him. Okay, how he's going to explain that away is going to be a difficult task. This one is not as difficult. The lack of blood outside. Well, actually, if we go back to the search warrant at his house, whoops, pull that out. If we go back to the search warrant at his house, okay, if any of this comes back, there's blood on here. Item number 12, A, B, and C. If that, and we don't know right now, if any of that is the victim's blood, and they're not going to drop that on the public right now, and the defense isn't going to run around and say they found any of the victim's blood at his apartment. If any of that belongs to the victims, or if that dog hair belongs to the dog, he's toast. And I'm talking about popping them in, you know, with Pop-Tarts on both sides. No deposit, no return. Because now you have to explain all of that potential evidence. So we don't know what the results of these pieces of evidence that they collected. Okay. If any of these hairs belong to the victims, he's toast. Okay. Because right now, the only thing that they put into that affidavit was the blood, was the car, the video. Okay. You can see the car on video, the phone pings, the victim identification, a knife sheath with DNA on it. There is a whole bunch more that we don't know anything about yet, completely. Now, outside, why is there no blood transfer? Okay. It is not hard sometimes it's difficult sometimes for people to understand that there isn't always blood. There is a high probability there was blood on his clothing. There was a high probability there was blood on his shoe. Okay. But we're not taking into account, did he take that into account post-incident? We know that there was a car parked out front that he allegedly jumped into and took off. He's wearing a pair of what they believe diamond triangle Vans. Vans are skater shoes, and they're slip-ons. Does he remove those shoes and run to the car? You have to ask that question. And 99% of the time, you don't get those answers until you sit across from the suspect and say, dude, we didn't find any blood outside. What happened? And they lean over and say, Yeah, I knew you would. I
Right.
took my shoes off.
Right. But Chris, if it's true that he bleached the car, we
Yeah.
have to presume that there was something in that vehicle, blood.
Well, and he bleached it in Pennsylvania.
Right. So we have to presume there was something in there, blood, semen, something that he was worried, could be incriminating. I mean, no one thinks that any of the victims was in the vehicle. So what was in the car? So it has to have been that there was some kind of covering or something that might have.
Yeah. Lucy's Vans are lace-ups. Okay. Yeah, but can you take them off? That's the question, right? For this kind of thought process.
Right.
Okay. And those Vans could have belonged to somebody that came into the house, or that shoe impression could also belong to somebody that came in, stepped in the blood, okay, as they were before the cops were called.
Right. Well, he had once worked for wasn't it like a fish market or something where you cut the fish up or something?
I don't
Wasn't that-
recall.
But because I mean, if that's true, he would have had some experience with covering the body, covering oneself to prevent cast off and things like that. I'm just saying, Chris, I suspect that if we could see his purchase history or the offender's purchase history, it wouldn't just be a knife. There had to have been medical-like equipment, covering something possibly to see in the dark with. That sheath would have been, dangling at his side, but he would have probably been dressed up like he was going in for a mission, face covering, dark clothes, ninja-like, probably all kinds of things on his person that he could need in case of emergency. Because he'd imagine himself going into like going in like for war, going into a war zone, and he would have had what he needed with him. And you don't get those things out of nowhere. I mean, he had to order those too.
Well, and that's why they went after
Right.
all of his purchases.
Yeah.
That's why they're chasing the money. Okay. And I want to, Adam says, is there any plausible theory involving their deaths that do not implicate Kohberger? The evidence suggests strongly that the answer is no, but do either of you have any doubt? Well, you never know, Adam, until you also have to use other logic to that. Okay. The other logic is when they first got Kohberger in custody and they told him, hey, your DNA is at this crime scene. I'll tell you, I've worked with a lot of people that, in fact, I took a lot of heat because of this guy who killed Stephanie Crow. The guy's name is Richard Tewitt. Okay. I took so much heat in San Diego. They made a movie out of it. They made books out of it. You name it, they did it. But you know what I said? That's not the guy. That's not your guy. And they arrested him. And they put him on trial. And guess what? Not guilty. And you know what my theory was, and I've talked about this dozens of times. You can watch. We did a whole show on it with the defense attorney. The guy's name was Richard Tewitt. He is a 5150 wackadoodle. And he was supposed to hide in this house for 20 minutes with a dog and like 5 or 6 people, and nobody noticed him. Okay. And I held out. So with Bryan Kohberger, I can guarantee you, if he would have said, I don't know how my DNA got in there, they would have reverse engineered it. And I would have reverse engineered it quickly to say, hey, we don't have the right guy here. But when you start now saying, okay, his DNA is here, how did that happen? I haven't heard Ann explain how it happened other than sod, some other dude. Some other dude planted it there. So that means that person must have had a conspiracy with Bryan Kohberger and got together and said, hey, Bryan, yeah, here, hold this. Oh, wow, this is a K-bar. I'll pop it open and clip it back and hand it back to you so that when you get the opportunity, you can plant it underneath the victim upstairs. Or, hey, look at this. I'm at the knife show and I can touch this, snap, do all these things, okay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Or I can go on Amazon and use that ASIN number and order one exactly like it. And they'll never figure out that it was me that did it, because the cops wouldn't be looking for these two ASIN numbers. Okay. So that's how I think reasonable doubt may not exist on the DNA aspect. And that's why they're going to attack the process, not the evidence. That's why the defense attacks the process. How was it collected? And we used to call that getting fonged, like O.J. Simpson. What about that, Mr. Fong? Gary Scheck used to ask. Well, isn't it true, Mr. Fong, you only wore one set of gloves, not two. You didn't put two sets of gloves on, did you, Mr. Fong? You must have, Mr. Fong, mixed Goldman and OJ's wife. You must have mixed their blood together and put it on the door handle of OJ's car, didn't you? The cops did that, didn't they? Okay. You see, that's a good defense attorney to attack, and I appreciate those kind of comments in here. Please don't sit on a jury, whatever you do. Get out of jury duty. Okay? Because the only people that suffer from thought process like that are these people. All 5 of those girls were in danger that day from one person, this person. Now, a jury will decide if he is the guy. No question about that. No question about it. But out here, we can say and do whatever we want, but they don't have that luxury. They never anticipated going to bed and having somebody slaughter them and leaving somebody else's DNA in the bedroom. You ever think about that piece of the puzzle? Does anybody think about the victims? I know thousands of us do in the chat, but every once in a while you get these crazy ideas about wanting to marry this guy. Okay. And that's okay. We're all entitled to opinions, but not one person can explain how his DNA got in that room. I want to hear from somebody tell me how his DNA got in that room, outside of the thoughts I just shared.
Especially if he was in the park.
Yeah, especially if he was stargazing in the park. Did he fly it in with a drone and drop it? I'll wait. Go ahead and start putting it in the chat.
But in response to the person's question, which I think was in good faith, but when
Of
some
course.
people ask it is not in good faith, but I think the person was asking in good faith because they're trying to figure out if what we're saying is that it's foolish to believe anything but that somebody is guilty, then you're flat out saying they are. I think all we're simply saying is you never know. It ain't over till the fat lady sings, as Yogi Berra said, right? We don't know. But certainly, I think we're allowed to opine that the evidence doesn't look very good, that he was not involved in some way, but we don't know.
Well,
You never know. Yeah.
When we take all the evidence together, and you're right, Gary, we don't know. That's a jury's responsibility, and it's up to the court to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay. But let's step back for a moment. If you go into a swimming pool and you dive in and you come out and you walk into a house and a detective comes around the corner and says, look at these wet footprints. They went into that house. Okay. Does that mean nobody went into that house? Or is it possible somebody had a rubber stamped foot that they stuck in the water and they stamped the concrete, got it wet again, and stamped it into the house to fool the cops? To fool the cops. Okay. I just think the only people that know for sure are, and thank you, Rhonda, the only people that know for sure. I want to hear how Bryan tells the world. And Gary, do you believe that now that the death penalty is on the table, that kind of shook Ted Bundy, didn't it?
Well, Bundy used it as leverage.
Right.
What he did was he said, if you really want closure on some of these cases, don't execute me. If you really want me to be an interesting specimen to psychology, forensics generally, law enforcement, let me help you by telling you about how pornography and other things kind of fueled me. And so he became interested. And I also think that, it's an interesting thing about when death penalty came on the table in the Kohberger case, what I thought is, in a way, if he is guilty, he might have been originally thinking, well, look, I'll take a gamble. If I get away with this, I get away with it. If I don't, then I can confess it later, and I'll get my ego thrills by writing my own book or telling people, in detail, or holding back what I want to, or answering letters from people who are interested or venerate me, and I'll get lots of attention. But then if you tell the person that they might die, you have leverage over them, because you can then say to them, well, look, if you did do this and ego was your motive, well, you're not going to get to tell your story, and people are going to tell stories about you that may have inaccuracies because all they're going to have is speculation. They're not going to have you. They won't have the horse's mouth to go to. And, you may miss out on that opportunity. So you'll have done this and then you'll die. So you may want to talk.
Do you think the personality type that did this, that took all this risk, high risk,
right?
And if it's a rage situation versus, if we look at that potentially, do the survivors take the stand? And the answer is yes. Yes. But right now, there's, again, when we started this broadcast tonight, we started it with the idea of this has been a game changer now.
Yeah.
It's been a game changer now, because now he has to process a loss. And his attorney is sitting down with him and saying, okay, plan B. we have to put into plan B. And what's the first thing? Well, we need a Franks hearing, i.e., let's attack the cops and the process. Okay. I want to hear him say, that's not my DNA. That's not me. Okay. Because I've sat across from many murderers who look you right in the eyes and say, okay, I'm going to tell you what happened. Here's what happened. Okay. I think, to Dr. Gary's point, this would be a perfect time for Bryan, if he's the guy, to tell your attorney, let's make a deal. Let's talk about this.
Right.
And if not, they're going to attack the process.
Yeah, well, you remember, Chris, I said that this is the type that if they saw something reported in the news that wasn't accurate, that might give credit to someone else, what they would call credit, they would insinuate themselves into the situation to correct the record. For example, I keep thinking about the Blum book. Did Kohberger read it? And if he read it, was he itching to take a red pen to it and correct it? That kind of thing. I would imagine so. If he's guilty, he would say, wait a minute, I'm going to go down in the annals of crime based on this, and this isn't accurate, that kind of thing. So I think if he is guilty, and let's say is concealing that fact, somebody should go in and appeal to his colossal ego and say to him, look, you're going to get nothing out of this because you won't even live to see.
Yeah. What a great point.
Right.
Yes. And I can see him now.
Right, exactly.
Okay, I see this new judge as really, really good in terms of just with the latest Frank motions. He admonished and chastised the defense. He says, look, stop dropping this stuff on me 24 hours before you want another hearing. That ain't happening anymore. Combine all of the motions. Give me the points that you want to make. Don't throw a bunch of spaghetti at the wall, essentially, and think that it's going to stick. Okay? It ain't working. And that's what he did with the death penalty. All of those citations and all of those, case law that she pointed out, et cetera, the judge he went right through in about 10 minutes. He said, nope, none of it applies. Death penalty's on the table. Next. And then she throws at him, well, we want a Frank's. If it's not over here, it's got to be over here. Nothing to see here. So let's move over here. Okay. And the judge isn't putting up with it. He's going to keep this case on schedule. And it's not going to be, it doesn't sound very good for her because he likes things a certain way. And the last motions, if you go read the motions, he just said, no, we're not playing that. Homie's not playing that game anymore. We're done. This is a different rodeo arena that you're in. And we're done. Yeah. All right.
But Chris, it sounds like we agree that the death penalty being on the table, especially in that state where there's options for the death penalty that are horrific, that this is leverage. This is the time that somebody needs to go in there and appeal. What do you think?
Yeah, this is the time. I mean, did the cops do it just right? No, there's mistakes. They made mistakes. But everybody makes mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Even the defense makes mistakes. They just got spanked because they made mistakes. Okay. And that I think that's one of the things that we forget about the system. The system is Lady Justice, and I say this a lot. Lady Justice wears a blindfold. She carries scales, or she has scales, and she has a sword. Sometimes the sword comes out, and the court goes, "Nope, we're not doing that." And a good defense attorney, and God bless her, her job is to lay a foundation for an appellate argument if he loses, because she also knows, and this is reality, you have to think about the totality of this DNA. How in the world did it get there?
Right. Well, and Chris, the point that you made tonight that I think it's very easy to miss that it's novel is the idea that you're really getting into motive. Now, look, if you start talking in a courtroom about motive, somebody is bound to tell you that it's not necessary to know it. He did it or he didn't. We don't care why. I think it matters enormously, because if somebody is operating like a serial killer, then there's a lot on the line if you let them out. A jury would need to know. You want to let a panther out of a cage, go ahead, but don't be surprised when we're back, that kind of thing.
It's great to see. He's a good professor of law, Adam.
Oh, Adam Lamparello, yeah.
Great to see him.
I've seen a lot of comments from Adam. I think are very good, and so that's the thing, Chris. I think that you're really getting to the interesting question of motive, and what you're suggesting, I think, that is food for thought, is the possibility that the motive was simply killing women. Yeah. That it was as simple as that this was basically a person with a misogyny and angry, and just basically went in there and that it was kind of opportunistic, and there were vulnerabilities in that house. And even if it was just, you start out with this potential focus, it could have been any woman in the house. And that's a really interesting question. And it cannot be disproved based on current information. But that is exactly the kind of information that, if Bryan is out there watching and he's guilty, we would like to know that. There are pieces of information like that we want to know. And if he is guilty, they're all in here, and people are only going to be able to speculate until he deigns to share that information.
Well, and this is a great comment from Sue. Okay. I'm not convinced Bryan did this. He had to have been covered in blood. There had to have been a trail. Dylan had to have heard it all. Tell me how you could just go to sleep. No way. Okay. Great points, great questions, great comment. Let me tell you about Matthew Checky. 9-year-old little boy at the urinal, going to the bathroom. Suspect comes up behind him, cuts his throat, arterial bleed, arterial blood spray. Every time his heart beat, blood. Every time. Now imagine doing that, right? And boom, he collapses. You can see the video of Brandon standing over him post-death, stabbing him multiple times. Guess what? You know where we found blood? Not on his clothing. We found it in the knife sheath and in a pocket, meaning not exterior, interior. He took the knife and put it in the sheath and slipped it into his pocket. And when we got his pants, we cut his pants open. And there was his blood inside, Matthew's blood inside, transfer. But at the crime scene, everything belonged to Matthew. None of it transferred onto Brandon Wilson. Nothing. So here's what I learned from that. It can happen. I went to a crime scene where a woman was stabbed 142 times. No blood on the suspect. 0. Imagine that. Doing this 142 times. Think about that. Every time that knife came up, all the blood was cast off in the front and cast off up to the ceiling. Came back down, cast off. Nothing got on the suspect. It was nuts. It happens. It happens. Maybe this is one of those times. Maybe he did have blood on him because at his house, he's got blood on his sheets. He's got blood in his bed. We don't know who that is yet. What if it comes back it is one of the girls or Ethan? Then guess what? All of us have been saying, those who are saying, well, that's impossible. I can't go there. Okay. Well, it is possible. It is possible. I originally thought it was Bryan and Brent Kohberger working together. What do you think? Susan, I love your thought process and thank you for your kindness. Anything's possible.
I think, Chris, if Bryan were able to form a relationship with a person that was intimate like that, he wouldn't have had to have done this.
Yeah, and the fact,
I mean, if he's the killer, I mean, he wouldn't have had to have done it. Then he wouldn't have had problems with interpersonal relationships.
Yeah, and he wouldn't have. And part of these questionnaires here, would you do it alone or did you do it with somebody else? And
Right.
I agree with you, Doc, that Bryan is a loner. He's that guy. He's been a lone wolf all this time, and he's been described as that. Okay, we're 2 hours into this.
Okay.
Thoughts, Dr. Brucato? Oh, here's one more.
Okay. I mean, I just think when we get questions like that, they're fair, but that you notice that in all that obsessing over all of these things, you know, there's this sort of convenient omission of the DNA problem. You know, it's sort of like, yeah, you know, there's the DNA with a 1 in, you know, whatever octrillion chance of that it's not him. But what about this? You know, it's like, you know, it sounds almost like Johnny Cochran, you know, is arguing with you, right? Like a defense attorney would argue to dazzle you away from.
Thank you.
From, you know, I mean, wouldn't you say, Chris, it feels that way, like sort of getting caught up in minutia to just to over analyzing to ignore a truth or ignore something and you know, you think to yourself, Occam's razor. I mean, you know, think of all the things that would have to be true to make what you're saying true. You'd need like someone to get DNA on something at another time, and then they frame you by bringing it in, and they just happen to, you know, pick a person to frame who has the characteristics that match the profile of the what you would expect to be the case here, and the person has links in some weird, vague ways to a couple of the, you know, it's just at some point you just cut, all right. And then like they're stargazing in the middle of the night, and which is kind of weird and difficult to believe. And like the sheath with the DNA is in the house while they're, you know, stargazing. And I just think a jury is going to say, you know, maybe I should check which of my 2 legs you're pulling when you try to get me to not pay attention. But I don't know. I mean, who knows what they'll come up with.
And I throw my trash into my neighbor's trash can.
Oh, who doesn't do that? You know, bleach the car, wear gloves.
Wearing gloves in the middle of the night.
Right.
I throw my trash in my neighbor's trash can just because. And the idea of, you know, is there always a percentage that he's not the guy? Of course, but the investigation has pointed to him. Okay. And all these other theories will come. I'm sure they will. You know, we talked about them earlier, but that's okay. Okay. I mean, you know, you get these high profile situations. I think the biggest problem, and I've been critical of the investigation on some parts, on some levels. But other levels, then no, they did the right thing. And the investigation's moving in the right direction. The biggest hurdle is going to be, like you just talked about, Gary, I somehow had my DNA on this sheath. It ended up on the 3rd floor of this building in the house, okay, where 2 young victims were murdered. Okay. And, how it got up there, I have no idea. I have no idea. I remember one time I had a caper, and this last war story. The guy goes in and says, puts a 12-pack up on the counter, and the clerk says, you got your ID? He goes, oh, yeah. He hands him the ID, and then he pulls a gun. He says, this is a robbery. And the clerk says, sure. Throws all the money on the counter. The crook takes off. Okay. We hook the guy up. I'm sitting in the interview with the guy. And I said, hey, you know anything about this? He goes, no. I said, I'll be right back. I threw his ID on the counter. The clerk took his ID and put it in his pocket. Right? The bad guy's ID. I threw it on the counter, on the table. Said, I'll be right back. Oh, here's your ID. Let's talk about this, shall we? Okay. The same process. That happens all the time, not the sharpest tools in the shed sometimes. Okay. And you know what? He's got to overcome that one. He's got to overcome that problem. Don't you think? The DNA?
It's going to be pretty difficult to overcome. You heard Francine say that on your show. Francine Bardol's one of the leading authorities on DNA in the world. She said she thought it was going to be very difficult, to get around that. You remember, Chris, when we were with her on the show here. And, but, you never know what people are going to do to kind of question things. I mean, that's what you do now in a contemporary case. You attack the science and try to say, what if the science is wrong? DNA, shmia, maybe it'll turn out to be, and it's very interesting, Chris. I've seen cases where there was a part of the public that for whatever reason vehemently defended a person in the true crime community, whatever. And then if they're found guilty, you never see those people come out and say, sorry, I was wrong. Sorry, I was wrong.
Yeah.
Never. They're always right from a perch, that kind of criticize, those who can't do criticize, as they say. So there's this kind of thing like where they love to kind of sit over there and know everything. And people that have been doing this stuff for a living don't know as well as I do. Well, as far as I'm concerned, that's the same attitude that a person like Bryan would have, that he knew better than everyone.
Yeah, he projects
and I think that some people identify with that kind of person, the smart, misunderstood guy who knows better than everyone, who, the totally put upon in an unfair way. Well, look, if he's guilty, we'll expect a lineup of people who say, sorry, I was wrong. And if we're wrong in our statements, we'll say so.
Yeah.
So far, we haven't had to. But if we're wrong, we'll say we came on the show, said something, and turned out we were wrong. This guy was exonerated, or this guy wasn't. It's the opposite of what we thought. But it hasn't happened yet.
No,
it hasn't happened yet. So you get what I'm saying, Chris? So I just think it's funny because you get these kind of armchair attacks and whatever, and they don't listen to anything you actually say. It's very interesting. They quote you back to you. And the things you said are totally distorted because these are the same. The whole point is you're dealing with people who think they're being logical, but they distort facts and think that they remember them right. So then they quote you back to you, and you're like, but I didn't say that. You go back and watch it. You twisted it. So I think the idea is when you have someone who has a preconceived idea, they'll twist and smash information, shoehorn it, to meet the, but I just think looking at this kind of objectively, it doesn't look very good for the suspect. But I'm open to anything. I'm totally agnostic. I mean, we have to think like scientists. show me evidence that disproves. I don't see much, but I'm open to anything because you never know what's going to come out in the defense. They may have information we don't, but what doesn't work is having a preconceived idea and then going in and twisting to make it, to do away with very damning problematic facts. I think you'd agree. There's a lot of that. It's very Bryan-esque,
Yeah, no, there's just so much sometimes. And, I just think, we just need to keep stay the course. If it's in the jury's hands now, let the jury,
Yeah.
fix it. And they will. But at the same time, we also have, the jury's going to use common sense. What I don't understand is when there's evidence out there that says, hey, this is common sense, that we have sometimes a difficult time doing that. And so even myself sometimes, I mean, a lot, just ask my sweetheart. Okay. But, there are times where you say, okay, this is maybe a universal God thing, and that the universe is on schedule. Every case I've ever had, I've always asked the Lord, show me what I'm not seeing. Help me see it. And then, and it got me into big trouble in the Stephanie Crow murder. I mean, there are people online even today that say I arrested those 3 boys. I didn't arrest those 3 boys. I said 15 years ago about the John Benet Ramsey case when I was involved in that, and you know that, Gary. I said, I have a problem with the garrote, the type of weapon that was utilized to strangle this little girl. Does the mother have the capability to make a garrote? I wanted to know that in her victimology. I wanted to know if the father had the garrote capability. I wanted to know that. And Lou, because I worked directly with Lou Schmidt on some people in California where I was asked to, get involved. And I have said to this day, I have a problem with the type of weapon that was utilized on that 6-year-old little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that a mother, and I think the public sometimes is overlooking what the autopsy said, that weapon was utilized multiple times to strangle her. They call that throttling. There's a terminology for it.
Right.
And that won't surprise me on other cases coming around the corner, by the way.
Well, you remember, Chris, I talked to Dr. Anna Salter, who's been on your show, member of the Cold Case Foundation.
Yep.
And I asked her about that garrote, her opinion on that. And she said that with all of her extensive experience, people don't do that with their own family members. It's not what you do. That's something a sex offender uses on a victim.
Right.
In parental abuse of children, you don't see that. And that's something that I think people forget when you're looking at profiling or whatever you want to call this idea of kind of conjecture about a crime scene or whatever, is that there's a difference between the horoscope-like quality that some people use where they're feeling things out or whatever, and something where you're using statistics. From a statistical perspective, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that a person would use a garrote on their own child. The facts are not consistent with the profile being that of a parent doing that to their own child. I think your instinct is borne out by statistics. That's why I keep databases.
Yeah, no,
that's the point. My profile on Kohberger was based on statistics.
So under your scars, here's my answer, and I'll go on the record again.
What you were talking about, that's the name of the person, under your scar.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know, but I think it's a stranger. I don't unless the father, which I don't think he did. That situation is so complicated, but it's not that complicated.
Right.
The fact that that little girl was taken downstairs, okay, into that basement, and we can have another show about this one day, Gary, that the
people are asking for it in the audience.
Are they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, show on Ramsey.
A lot of it we can talk about now. I mean, because when I got involved in it, it was early on when Lou Schmidt came into the case. And the reason I got involved in it, there was information of a sex offender that was out in our area. And I was asked to go locate the individual. And by the way, people don't even know I was involved in the West Memphis 3.
I know you were involved in the West Memphis.
You know, that were slaughtered in
right.
Memphis. But you can go and you can type in the name Christopher Morgan in YouTube, and I come up interviewing him. And somebody had put it up on YouTube. I had nothing to do with it. But those are the kind of things back in, you know, in my time, and Gary knows I still work 8 hours a day. People don't realize I'm still doing this. But the garrote thing, to answer your question, if we can answer that question and then discover through our latest DNA techniques, we're going to find who that murderer is. And if it's, you know, somebody in the circle, i.e. who had access to that house, which is all indications that it's somebody that had, just like when, you know, Elizabeth Smart was kidnapped there, when her sister was saying, I don't remember who, then all of a sudden had an aha moment and said, I remember, it was the handyman. And lo and behold, he had done some work with the family. This is going to be one of those situations. This guy had access to that house somewhere. And of course, there's a lot of theories out there. They're not mine, they're Lou's. But when he told me all the things that were available back then, and he told me about the garrote back then, because I asked him, because I had to go interview, you know, if I ran into this guy and interview him, I said, what was the murder weapon? He says, well, it was a paintbrush that was broken half, and it was a shoelace that was utilized and tied, and it was utilized as a garrote. And it was like this. The suspect would tighten it, then loosen it. Tighten it, then loosen it. Okay. That is an autoerotic behavior.
Yeah. The sexual sadist.
It's a sexual sadist.
And a sexual sadist that would do such a thing in such a risky way and all that wouldn't be their first rodeo. It would be somebody with a history of sexual violence against children, almost certainly, who, unless he was capable of knowing that the child was in that house, would have kind of, you know, I mean, is the idea that he would have just probably busted into the house knowing that she lived there, would be my guess.
Yeah.
So, you know, because he had seen her out somewhere. I mean, I would posit a weird guy, a kind of a child predator that wasn't good at grooming because he didn't have the social skills or the look. So he would be sort of a weird dude that would sexually offend against children in this way, where you break into the house and snatch them or get them on the street or whatever. So you would imagine that whoever did this would stand out as weird.
Yeah.
Who wouldn't be a good groomer type and was a sadist. So that would have a history of being, you know, not only weird, but nasty, you know, and vindictive, and, you know, have a lot of the traits of a sadist. And I think Chris would almost certainly have had priors with kids, probably been on the radar of law enforcement, things like that. Because, you know, you and I both know that a sexual offense like that against a child, unless it's, you know, the person who's doing it is like 18, chances are it's not your first rodeo, right? I'm waiting for us to find out about Stefan Stearns.
Yeah, great point.
Stefan Stearns. I mean, does anybody believe that this would be Stefan Stearns' first offense if he's guilty? You'd probably expect loads of priors, or at least experimentation with, because that's how those offenders work. They do it once, and then it's, you know, over and over and over and over. And so it's a horrifying thing. But that's a grooming situation. This, whoever committed John Bonet, I think, was just a kind of oddball that saw her somewhere and knew where she was, and in this kind of disorganized way, used whatever objects were in the basement to commit a sadistic act, kind of, right. Wasn't it like broad daylight on holiday with people in the house? I mean, disorganized. It wasn't a very smart, intelligent person who went there with a plan. So that's why I posit a peculiar person, and and there are peculiarities in that ransom note.
Yeah, I mean, it's all out in the public now. It's all in the environment. There's been books and it's all online, but nobody can answer the garrote. I want to know. I want to hear from all the experts, yourself included, Gary. I want to hear from all the experts. That's
real experts or the armchair experts.
Well, I'll listen to both, but at the same time, I know who I'm going to lean towards 1,000%. But we need to do a show on John Bonet and kind of weigh in just some thought process there. But I know there's some DNA that the family's been trying to get tested. Yeah. So, Gary, love you like my brother. Let's go to Hawaii. What do you think?
Okay, may I have a last thought here?
You got it, bro.
I just want to say that Thanksgiving is coming up. I hope everybody has a wonderful Thanksgiving, experiences of real gratitude about the blessings in their life. But I think it's a time when the families of the victims in the Kohberger case, the Idaho murders, that is to say, in the case of which he is accused, are looking across the table and seeing empty chairs, and it's harder than ever. Any of you in the audience who have experienced a loss, a horrendous loss, especially through suicide or murder or something else, know the pain of the empty chair at the holiday seat. And Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's are like a kind of hell for people that have been through that. I think it's a time when you really have to hug tight the people that are around you, because one day there'll be no more. One day they may not be there. And you have to kind of look across the table and think, maybe you drive me crazy. Maybe you have ideas that bother me. Maybe you're irritating. Maybe we've had stupid fights. But at the end of the day, I love you. And just put all your differences aside in this heated year. Put all your differences aside and look across the table and think, wow, I love these people. In the meantime, I'll be on December 10th, I think it is. I'll be on the Peacock show. I think it's Peacock Oxygen. I can't remember. On Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. So you'll be able to see me there. And Chris and I are plugging away at the book we're doing on the Cold Case Foundation. And we'll let you know when that's available. And for those who have gotten The New Evil and read it and written to me about it and all that, please remember reviews are very helpful. That's how we get more book deals. People see that books sell and are popular. So please do that. And in the meantime, God bless everybody. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. And I think, Chris, you would echo the point about victims. Yep. We're very victim focused. And I think, Chris, I don't need to tell you about the pain of the empty chair.
God bless everybody. You guys, we appreciate each and every one of you.
Yeah.
I couldn't have said it Gary's just awesome. So take care of each other. Aloha, everybody. And if you wouldn't mind, if you could hit the thumbs up and the subscribe button if you've not subscribed, that really does help the show progress. So thank you very much. Have a good one. Happy Thanksgiving.
Hard working every day, I'm stressed out 24/7, babe. No timeouts, wish we could fly away. You and I go to our favorite place. Oh yeah, make special memories together. I'll be your company now and forever. I say we fly away. we're taking away. Yeah, we're taking away. We'll never come down. We're going away. Yeah, we're going away. You and me. Feeling the sun on my face in a while.